Hey, good morning, everybody, to day 3 of the Stand Up for Grain Safety Week. I'm your moderator this week. My name is Barb Grove, and I'm the Quality Systems Manager at Central Valley Ag and past president of the Jeeps organization. Also, proudly one of the founders of Stand Up for Grain Safety Week. This started with a few people coming together and saying, you know what? How can we help people do better? We need to put a focus on grain safety. There's a lot of education out there, has been for years, but how do we get people to pay attention and do what they need to do to keep themselves safe every day? So here we are and excited to be here. So today's session is Body Mechanics 101, or better known to us all for years as ergonomics. Um, so I want to make sure that everybody has a great experience here. So if you are having any technical issues, first, check your settings. Do you have your volume up as high it needs to be? We all know in this day and age of having used Zoom or Teams for a long time that the more things we have up in the background, the more that our own screen may buffer. So check those things first. To see if you just have a backlog on your own system. But otherwise, if you are still having some problems either seeing screens or hearing, do a direct chat message. You'll see his name out there in participants, Salah Isa. He is our Zoom master and our tech support behind the scenes. Or if you get kicked out for some reason and can't get back in, please email grainsafety2010 at gmail.com. I think Catherine will be posting that out there in the chat just so you have it. So again, if you get kicked off or something, go ahead and shoot a message out to that. So these learning sessions this week are brought to you by the Grain Elevator and Processing Society, or JEEPS, and the Grain Handling Safety Council, GHSC. We also have generous support from some great sponsors out there. And we're going to pop those up on the screen because, again, without their help, this free education would not be possible. So people that we have helping us this week, we have ADM, the Bartlett Grain Company, Central State Center for Agriculture Safety and Health, or CS Cash, Central Valley Ag, CL Jones Consulting LLC, Grain Elevator and Processing Society, or JEEPS, the Grain and Feed Association of Illinois. We have Grain Journal, Kansas State University, the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the University of Nebraska Med Center, Lamar Advertising Company, and the National Grain and Feed Association. So again, let's show your support by throwing the clapping emoji out there, or hit the react button at the bottom of your screen and show some love for these people. Again, without them, this free education would not be possible. And also, we want to make sure everybody understands that as this week is dedicated to safety, we want to remind everybody of our rights and our responsibilities. Employers are required to provide a safe and healthy workplace free of known hazards, even if you are not subject to OSHA enforcement. And as an employee, you have the right to a safe and healthy workplace free of hazards, and to be able to report concerns without fear and retaliation. So again, as we come back to what this week is about, it's, hey, we want to make sure that everybody goes home safe, everybody goes home with all of their limbs, and that we can enjoy being at work, but we can enjoy our families. So with that, we want to make sure that we stay engaged in this session. that we will have different chat things happening on. We will have Q&A. We will have polls. We want to hear from you. So make sure if you have any questions, if you have any comments, again, it's about learning from each other. That's why we come together. We have our different sponsors and we have our alliance group is because we know we don't know everything. We want to learn from other people too. So as our speaker is working on his presentation or giving that to you, make sure if you have, again, some more good information that is beneficial to all of us, go ahead and put that in the chat. At the end of the day's session, when you exit the Zoom, there'll be a very short survey that will pop up in your browser, and we encourage you to complete it so that you can share your thoughts, your suggestions, any ideas for the future. Again, we want to give the education to you that you really feel you need. So let's start getting everybody active in the chat box and tell us where you are viewing from today. And sorry, I was just trying to get mine in there. So tell us where you're from. We think that's very interesting to see where we're reaching from. Excellent. Boy, you guys are quick on the fingers there. All right. So why we're doing that, again, just want to know that we do have supports people in the background, kind of keeping an eye if somebody has a question that may go towards regulatory. We have people just kind of keeping an eye on that. And just again, reminder, as everybody sees, just peeling through that chat box where everybody's from, um, everybody comes from um, could be a state enforcement, could be from overall enforcement, and could be different regulations in a different country. So just keep that in mind that something that may be stated could come from that person's point of view from what's happening in the state that they are working in. All right. So we are going to pop up a little poll because we want to know how many people are joining us today. So tell us how many people are in there with you and why we do that. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. So again, we want you to be active. So I want to throw this out there as another chat question as you get started because it's our topic today. So what do you think of when you think of ergonomics? Go ahead and throw that answer in the chat, and that may give us a little more fodder for discussion with our speaker. So today's speaker is Dr. Aaron Yoder. Dr. Yoder is a PhD and associate professor in the Department of Environmental Agriculture, Occupational Health at the University of Nebraska Med Center and the Nebraska Extension. He works with projects through the NIOSH-funded Central State Center for Agriculture Safety and Health and Safety, CS Cash. Aaron grew up working on his grandparents' farm in Pennsylvania. He is known for his research into technology solutions and to increase safety across the agriculture spectrum. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Aaron.
All right. Thanks, Barb. And I appreciate everyone being here today and the opportunity to share with everyone on here. As Barb said, it's great to get your questions. We'll have those people wrangling those for us and trying to figure out good times to answer those. We'll try to respond to those in a timely manner. And whatever they tell me to do, I'll do, whether they tell me the questions ahead of time or as we go through them at the end. But once again, I'm Aaron Yoder. I'm an associate professor at the University of Nebraska. I get the opportunity to work at our medical center as well as our ag campus, and through extension, do stuff like tractor safety, our ag ability program, and then here at UNMC, I get to work with our Central State Center for Ag Safety and Health. So I tell everybody I have a whole bucket full of hats that I wear. So that gives me the opportunity to interact with a lot of great people. So for today, covering our body mechanics and our ergonomic injuries, um, I don't have the chat window open right now, but I saw some of your responses as far as what you think of when you hear the term ergonomics. So hopefully we'll expand that a little bit, and even if you are very familiar with that, you'll get another opportunity to gather a little extra information or ask some questions, interact with others around this topic. So for today, that basic understanding of what ergonomics is, things that we talk about, cumulative trauma disorders. Ergonomics aren't as easy to manage sometimes as many of our other injury sources and hazards that we have in agriculture or grain handling, just because there's sometimes a chronic condition that develops over time. The acute injuries, if someone gets cut or a traumatic injury, those show up right away, where some of these other ones take a little bit longer. Some of our sprains and strains can show up right away, but other types of musculoskeletal disorders, as they talk about, those type of ergonomic injuries take some time to show up and to get aggravated enough that we seek some attention for them. So we'll talk about those ergonomic risk factors, and then probably most importantly is how do we control some of those risk factors to prevent ergonomic type injuries. So big goal for today is to gain that understanding of how ergonomics applies to your job or the people that you manage. So, a little bit humorous, but it seems that way sometimes. We've all used a tool or been in a situation where it seems like this was not designed to fit me. Most people are fairly average shaped, but some of the positions we get ourselves in and some of the situations we have to work in makes us think, what was the person thinking that designed this, or were they even thinking when they designed this? So, how do we make ourselves fit that job a little bit better or change the job or task? And our facilities are a big part of that, or other things that makes it fit us better, which makes it easier for us to do. And normally, easier means it's better for our bodies as well. So, scientific definitions, as a scientist, like to pull these up. So, the study of human interaction with the work environment. So, this can be many things. A lot of times, people throw out their office chairs, how we sit, how we stand, how we interact with some things that are there. Some of the things that we don't sometimes think about in ergonomics is that mental capacity or mental capabilities. They call that cognitive stuff. So we sometimes joke when people say, I need to turn the radio down because I need to focus, when we're driving or something. But there's a lot of truth to those statements that sometimes we can get overwhelmed mentally and then we can't figure out how things work as well. And this is mostly important or mainly important all the time, but even extra important during emergency situations. So, if it's a shut off switch or a kill switch, if it's a toggle type switch, do we turn it up or down to turn it off? A lot of times those switches are ones that we just press and we know which way they work. If we had to pull a switch out to get a machine to stop, that would not be intuitive, and then that overloads our mental capacities at the time of traumatic events like that. So thinking about the tools and equipment we interact with, our work methods and tasks that we do, and even our working environment, the temperature that we're working in. We talk about heat illness in the summertime and sometimes cold weather implications on our bodies. But even, if we're, working in any of that, working in direct sunlight, not direct sunlight, all those things impact how we react to situations or how we interact with the tools and people that we're working with. And then in some of my cases, the animals that we're working with in some of the agricultural operations. So, our goal of ergonomics is to reduce those work-related injuries by adapting the work to fit the people. So, work comprises that whole what we're physically doing, but then also the environment around us that we're doing it in. So, keeping that broad spectrum on ergonomics as we talk about all this stuff. So, like I said, ergonomics is not only the design of the jobs and tools and equipment, but how people use them. I did a research study with people using shovels, so trying to define a better shovel. So we early on, I think I decided that cavemen tied rocks to sticks and used those as shovels, and it really hasn't evolved much since. So a lot of the shovels that we see out there are pretty archaic. A lot of times people are using shovels that have been around for a long time. And then there's some misguided shovels out there, like the what they call ergonomic shovels that have bent handles and certain things. And they're ergonomic in some situations if you're throwing things straight in front of you. But if you go to throw something to the side, they have a weird lever arm that makes you actually exert more force. So some of the things that are claimed to be ergonomic may or may not be. But that's just a simple example of how people use the tools. We were digging dirt. And we found that most men kicked a shovel different than women did. It was a study aimed at women using farm tools. And thinking about and watching how people use tools, giving them suggestions or changing the tool for their preferred method of using it. So this is just a quick example of wheel chocks. So oftentimes we use wheel chocks in different facilities to keep a vehicle from moving when we disconnect trailers, other things like that. So if we think about sort of the standard wheel chocks that have maybe a rope between them or a chain between them, how we put those in place and how we remove them and our body positions when we do that, what type of forces do we need to do? How long are we doing this task? If it's a dock worker doing it many times a day versus is it a truck driver only doing it a few times a day? So taking all that stuff into considerations. So one example that I thought was pretty cool that I saw one company do was this. So they put a handle so the person doesn't have to bend over. You can see handles halfway down that they can push those into the tire and put them in and out. Maybe it takes a little more storage space, so taking that into consideration, but much easier for the person trying to put these wheel chocks in. So we adjust their working height. They don't have to bend over and stoop as much. The redesigned handles help them grab and put into place. And even sort of the mechanical advantage you get from having longer levers hooked to things help improve that. So changing those work procedures helped the ergonomics of a simple situation like putting wheel chocks in. Post pounders are another one that we see a lot and oftentimes using hand tools, different ways of doing it. I saw one the other day. There's just too many reels out there of people doing foolish things on the internet. But they were using a post pounder kind of like a sledgehammer. They didn't actually have it slid over the post. They were either using the blunt end or using the side of it trying to drive a post in. So just because we give people the right tools doesn't mean they're always going to be using the tools correctly. And there are different versions of these that have different handles. We tried some of this again with a group of women farmers that I worked with, and the weight of different things, how high you have to lift it to get it over the post. Do you put it on the post before you stand it up? Versus the guy completely on the right that's using a sledgehammer way up over his head. That's an awkward angle with his shoulder. You're not going to pound too many posts like that in one day. Versus the guy fully on the left that have to commend his safety gear that he has all that on, even his safety glasses. The other one I would say is maybe a hard hat. I've seen people pick these up off the post, then hit their heads with them. So we see people doing all kinds of stuff. So a big part of ergonomics is watching people, see how they use the tools, helping them use the tools correctly, and instructing them with that. So our main goal there is to reduce the physical strain, like it says across the bottom there. So if we can grab the pounder in kind of a neutral position, like the guy on the left, with our elbows around 90 degrees, versus picking the sledgehammer way up over our head, trying to hold it at the same time. If you have a good partner, maybe they'll hold the post for you until you hit their hands a time or two. But yeah, so other hazards of working with people. So why do we want to do ergonomics? So there's lots of reasons. If nothing else, I try to sell it to people by saying it's going to allow you to do the things you enjoy to do. So that's supposed to be what those pictures on the left are, out there doing things that we enjoy to do. So it gives us more time to do stuff, more energy to do stuff after work or around work. If we're looking at it from the business perspective, it's going to make people more productive to do things that are less taxing on their body. It's going to have people show up to work more often, and that sort of thing. So making sure people are there, showing up to work. We know it can be challenging to find employees sometimes. So if we keep them healthy and safe, it's going to help that. Lower workers' compensation costs, we'll get into that a little bit. I've partnered with some insurance agents here in Omaha and looked at, what's costing employers the most. Things like slips, trips, and falls come up to the top of the list quite often, but even these ergonomic type injuries sneak their way in there, and they can be pretty costly injuries when it comes to workers' compensation. Unfortunately, fatalities are cheaper than most of these other types of injuries because there's just kind of a lump sum and not a reoccurring cost. Where when we look at some of these chronic type injuries that ergonomics can lead to, they can lead to very expensive injuries over time. And then, like the last bullet points there says improved worker morale. Again, keeping your workers happy is going to keep them on the job more often, going to keep them showing up, and just going to help with safety culture in the workplace if everybody's morale is good. All right. So when we talk about barriers, this is what we think of. But what are the barriers when it comes to doing ergonomics and to do ergonomics well? Sometimes it's information, sometimes it's knowledge, sometimes it's accountability, sometimes it's management and how management handles things. But more often than not, when we talk about safety barriers for safety, it's time and money or perceived time. How much time does it take to do a task that's safer and easier versus just straining through something? Which eventually catches up with us. And then the additional cost, is the ergonomic tool or tools that fit our workers better a little more costly? Potentially. But then they're also going to probably have a better return on investment by having lack of injuries and lack of the cost of injuries. So when we think about the barriers that are out there in the workplace to prevent us from doing ergonomics, there's a lot that we can come up with, both mentally, physically, cost wise, time wise. There's lots of different things we can think of. So again, many of those that I mentioned, cost concerns. Resistance to change is one. So people's cognitive mentality on thing. I mentioned lack of awareness or training or um, maybe management's perspective on there. And one of my least favorite statements that I get all the time for people, well, we've always done it this way. That's never a good reason to continue doing something, is to say we've always done it that way. So I encourage all of you to remove that from your statement of phrases or your list of phrases that you say. To say we've always done it that way, normally I push back on that pretty quickly. But I think probably the largest barrier there is recognizing what the problem is or if the problem exists. Like I said, a lot of these injuries are chronic and build up over time. So we may not see the impact of the injuries for a long time. So we may not recognize what's causing those injuries because of that. Where in an acute case of an injury or an instant injury, we can see what caused that problem. So one of the largest categories we talk about in ergonomics is musculoskeletal disorders. So these are things related to our muscles and our skeleton. So bones and muscles. We can throw ligaments in there as well, nerves, tendons, that type of thing. If we've ever had a sprain or a strain on an ankle, we know that that sticks with us for years, maybe forever, or knee injuries. That's why I tell people not to jump on and off of ladders and machinery. It's great when you're in your teens and 20s. In your 30s, you start feeling it. In your 40s, you really feel it. By the time you get in your 50s and 60s, it can turn into a disabling injury that prevents you from doing certain things. So making sure that we are aware of all those cumulative type traumas to our muscles and skeleton and everything else that goes along with that. So these can be acute trauma type injuries. Like I said, sprains and strains can come from a single event, but a lot of the ones we see are cumulative trauma disorders, far right corner there. So these are the ones that develop over time from those repeated exposures. So when we talk about injury for prevention, a lot of times what we do is reactive. So we wait till something bad happens, then we tell everybody else not to do it after it happens once. So that's kind of a reactive approach. That doesn't work real well in ergonomics, especially since the thing that I said about these cumulative trauma type disorders, it might be years till we realize some process or some job task that we're doing is starting to create injury in workers. And it may, in some workers, may be more susceptible to those type of injuries, where others may not. So being reactive is never a good way to try to prevent injuries. So instead, we talk about being proactive. So what proactive means is let's do some audits, let's look around the facility, let's do maybe some near miss stuff or some starting of pains. Did anybody have pain today? And what do you think caused that? Or looking at the tasks that people have. So trying to be a little proactive to create, hopefully prevent any injuries from occurring or minimize those injuries that do occur. So making sure that we, target some of those risk factors that we can identify early on. So I'll show you a few tools we can use to help identify those risk factors. Uh, one of my favorite photos. I have back pain to this day from throwing small square bills and climbing ladders and other things like that, working in agriculture. So, again, categories, I've mentioned them a few times, but those acute injuries are the ones that occur instantly. These ones oftentimes are easier to prevent and easier to see that they're going to occur and to track and try to make future preventions versus those cumulative injuries on the right side there that develop over time. So minor sprains and strains, some of those can be instantaneous or acute, some of those over time. Back injuries when it comes to sprains and strains and back disc-related injuries, herniated discs and pinched nerves, as well as carpal tunnel, which we've probably heard of, where we do some traumatic injuries to our arms and wrists over time, and then we get some swelling that prevents parts from moving and also prevents blood circulation. So we see lots of different variations related to our carpal tunnel. So, Catherine created this great activity for me. So, give you the opportunity, and I'll open my chat to look at it real quick. But so we call this a chat storm. So, if you're multitasking, come back to us and answer this question for us in the chat. So, we have a few questions about what is acute or trauma, or acute or cumulative. So, our first one. Um, Thinking about, I'm going to go back to that. So the first example here would be a slip and fall that creates a head injury. Would that be acute or cumulative? Go ahead and type your answers in the chat there, and we'll take a look and see. Hopefully that one was yes. Lots of good answers there. Um, Now we have something like a pinched nerve in your back. Do you think that is acute, uh, cumulative, or could be both? Yeah, yeah, good answers. So I appreciate the engagement there. I'm going to click off of that and go on to my next slides, but thank you for participating in that. So when we talk about these musculoskeletal disorders, like I mentioned early on, the productivity, the lost work time, a lot of those things that we can see from these. But if we look at number of lost work days, when we look at an average of the data as a good scientist or researcher, we look up data, and our insurance company has helped us a lot with this. Some of our other companies that we work with help us by tracking these. But you know, when we look at the number of lost work days for these type of injuries, we're looking at 5 days as kind of the median number with most type of injuries. When we talk about a musculoskeletal type of injury, those can go up to the median of 25 days. So we see some that are a lot longer, some that are a little bit shorter. When we look at cost of injuries, we do a lot of different surveys and collect some reports on this. You can see the musculoskeletal disorders are about 10 times more expensive. A lot of times they involve a lot of therapy and doctor visits to get straightened out, where maybe an acute type injury is a little bit of medical care and some follow-up, so a lot less costly. It's really hard to capture the cost of injuries because a lot of people don't understand how much their health insurance pays for things if they have health insurance. A lot of times people just report their out-of-pocket costs with those things. So we try to track down both of those numbers. And then there's other costs like loss of productivity, loss of wages, things that oftentimes don't get accounted in those. So the more days we're off of work, the more of those less counted type values are being missed. So bottom line there is, longer duration of time away from work, longer treatment times, and then sometimes even a greater work disability. When they do come back to the job, they can't do the same tasks that they did previously if they have a chronic injury that's not going to go away. So over time, back injuries are one of the ones that I think came up from some people, in early on when we talked about ergonomics. And so we talk a lot about how to prevent back injuries by limiting the amount of force we lift, lifting with our legs, different postures and procedures for that. Sometimes it's adapting what we're lifting. If it's bags, maybe having multiple handles on them or grips on them so we can do them. Sometimes using gloves so we can grip stuff better and have better grip strength can reduce the amount of things like carpal tunnel injuries from grabbing stuff all the time. So there's things we can adapt for that. But when we originally started tracking some of this data, we can see that the type of costs, and a lot of this has to do to medical costs and insurance costs. But 1978, way back then, um, I wasn't very old then, but I was around. So, an injury may look like an initial back injury, $1,000, with no lost time with the original injury. But then over time, if we keep re-injuring that same injury because it's a little weaker now, I know ankles are that way, backs are that way. Once we have a small injury, it can start adding up. And then once this is following the same person over time, how much more that adds each time they make that injury worse. So making sure if we do have some injuries that we adapt our work site and tools and maybe how we do tasks to prevent that from happening. So over time, we can see that initial injury that only cost maybe $1,000 is up over $500,000 throughout the years and re-aggravation of that. So prevention, whether it's early on in preventing the original injury or preventing further injuries from people that already have some sort of kind of injury related to musculoskeletal stuff like back injuries, can help save us cost, the individual costs as well as the company costs over time. So when we want to kind of target these injuries, trying to look at, how can we prevent those injuries? A lot of that is the early indicators of looking at the signs of those injuries. And if we can address these earlier, sometimes we can prevent a full injury from occurring. So things like decreased grip strength, loss of muscle function, loss of range of motion. A lot of this stuff, and I'll mention it later on, is things that if we think of, I pull a lot of the stuff I do from athletics and how we treat athletes. If even if you played sports in high school, you didn't just go and play the sport without practicing, without stretching, without doing a little bit of strength training. So it seems kind of silly to tell somebody, hey, maybe you need to do strength training for your job. And I see there's different companies have different perspectives on this. We have a Kawasaki plant here in Nebraska, outside of Lincoln. And the first time corporate came to that, when they built that facility, they realized there was no gym in it. And they wanted to give the workers an opportunity because they found out in their other operations that if they gave their workers an opportunity to have gym, to use a gym, to do a little bit of strength training, it kept their workforce healthier. So, encouraging people to do different types of stretches. Maybe it's on company time, maybe it's other types of incentives for doing that. Sometimes we have health incentives at our workplaces to get people into the gyms to strengthen different muscle groups. This is definitely important as we age. One of the biggest misconceptions is just because we do a physical job that we're in good shape. And you can go around to a lot of the job sites where people do physical labor, and that's not always the case. So having a little bit of exercise and other stuff like our doctors all tell us helps prevent other health conditions as well. But keeping muscle strength, sometimes our cardiovascular health, all that can lead to keeping us more productive and healthier in the workplace. So we can see a lot of these signs that we can pick up on early on, and then maybe we can do something to counteract those. So, when we talk about signs and symptoms, lots of different things that are happening there, from muscle cramps and pains after we do a task. I can remember a few weekends ago, we were replacing a fender on my son's car. The next day, when I woke up, I felt like I did 1,000 squats the day before. My legs were sore, my back was sore, and I realized that getting up and down off the floor or just squatting down to position the fender and do different tasks to it, I probably did 1,000 squats the day before. So, that made me think, well, maybe next time I do something like that, I should either be more careful about how I position my body, or do a little bit of do it, split it up into multiple days instead of spending 10 days or 10 hours in one day to do something. So thinking about those management things. But so those are all signs of kind of the symptoms that we may have been doing a task that was not beneficial to our bodies or harmful to our bodies. And we know that a lot of times the injury progression with these type of ergonomic injuries is kind of cumulative over time. Maybe starts off with a little fatigue and stiffness, and then the pain starts coming and going every time we do the task. And then in worst case scenarios, it starts turning into continuous pain or maybe eventually a loss of function. Maybe we can't do that task anymore because we wore our bodies out by the way that we were doing it. So if we could pick up in that early stage of, fatigue and stiffness, what did I do? Why is it causing me this pain? And how can I prevent that from happening again? Is always a good thing to think about. So when we talk about specific type of injuries, and this one hits home with me with some spinal movement and spinal injuries, when we think about the ways that we can move our spine, bending forward, bending backwards, bending sideways, or twisting and rotating, um, there's lots of good evidence out there of doing these things in different ways and different formats can injure our back. There's something called the NIOSH lifting equation, which I always got a kick out of in agriculture, but it talks about it's an equation we can put numbers into that gives us how heavy of a load should we be lifting based on how far do we have to bend to pick it up, how high are we putting it, are we twisting as we're doing it, what's our footing like on our hand, where we're standing. If we're standing on a firm surface, we can lift more weight. Always found it funny in agriculture. I mentioned the small square bales. If we looked at stacking hay in a barn, standing on hay bales, which aren't a solid surface, I think the equation spits out about that your hay bale should be about 10 pounds. And that's kind of funny for anybody that's actually worked in agriculture because hay bales can range from 50 to 100 pounds sometimes, depending on how friendly your uncle is that are making the bales for you. So it's kind of interesting to take a look at that. It is good guidance, and especially in some industrial settings, it gives us things to look at, and maybe we can modify that task. So, in my example with putting hay in the barn, using an elevator or a track system to get it up into the barn rather than standing on a trailer full of loose bales and throwing the hay bales up over my head, putting it on a conveyor to get them up there into the barn rather than standing there throwing things. So there are some things we can do to modify those work practices. Herniated discs are a big one. Talked to several people who have had, minor surgeries or have some pain for this. 3 million people annually, like it said, those aren't all work related, but a lot of those would be. So what that is that's the part in our spine that kind of keeps our discs apart. So it can have a little bit of a leak or a tear. There's different ways they can repair these. Um, and we see these mainly in the lower back. That's where mine's at, but then also in the neck, where we see these discs being herniated as we do different tasks or as we land awkwardly when we fall. And then sometimes our bodies just wear out, right? So over time, we get that degradation in our spine where things start wearing out. And then what that does is it starts compressing different parts like our nerves that are inside there. And that can lead to some other types of pain. And again, modern medicine can do a great job once they figure out what's going on with a little bit of imaging, and then they can come up with some different treatment plans for those. I mentioned the carpal tunnel early on, so if we take a look at this, this is kind of what we're talking about. There's a lot of stuff that goes through our what is called the carpal tunnel. So we have nerves, tendons. So most of the time when we move our fingers, the tendons pull way up into our arms. So through this tunnel, as we're moving our fingers around, you can feel things moving in your forearms. But if this gets a lot of pressure on that, either from pushing against things or inflammation over time, from that. What that can lead to is a lot of pain, as well as not being able to move our fingers or losing strength in our hands, and our grip strength suffers from that. Sometimes that can be injuries or sprains where we overdo it. Sometimes it can be other things. Some people are more prone to inflammation than others. And then there are things we can do in our diet keeping our salt intake down, blood pressure down, those type of things that can help alleviate some of those as well. So again, lots of good guidance out there if you suspect those type of injuries. But what happens through that carpal tunnel is we've got these little, they call them sheaths, so covers on our tendons that move in and out. And as those get damaged or inflamed for overuse or sometimes tears and sprains, the scar tissue can build up in there. And then sometimes that can lead to either lack of movement or pain when we have the movement in those areas. So lots of different things they can do to help with that, sometimes clearing out those passageways or making more room. So different treatment options. The sooner we catch these type of cases, the better the treatment options or more variety of treatment options. When it becomes a severe case, it oftentimes results in some surgery to open up those spaces. Trigger finger is another one that's similar to that. When we get some nodules or other parts trapped in there, and those tendons start sticking in the sheath. So we might get the situation where our fingers are bent and we can't open them easily. We either have to pull on them or push them against something to get them to open. So that's some early signs of different types of finger-related injuries. I know with trigger finger, they can do some injections to help open up those passageways. If that doesn't work after a few of those, then they start doing some more surgical methods of relieving those and removing some of those nodules. And then it's always important to know the difference between heart disease and musculoskeletal disorders. We see different things. We hear about heart disease a lot. And as we have an aging workforce, something to think about. As we have people using a lot of substances like caffeine, it's something to think about as well. So, what's the difference between the heart disease and the musculoskeletal disorders? And if we can't tell, that's when we need to seek medical attention to be able to help us with that. So a lot of times, there's different signs for the different types of implications for us, different symptoms, whether it's pain and numbness versus the shortness of breath and the arm pain that they talk about. There's risk factors for both of those. With our heart disease, it's more the high blood pressure, physical activity, age, and other genetic things that might come into play there. Versus the musculoskeletal disorders, it's normally more from when we use a lot of repetitive force or excessive force, we can pick those type of things up. Um, there's a lot of different things when we go down to that root cause, when we try to prevent those type of things, lifestyle and genetics when we talk about heart disease, but then when we talk about the musculoskeletal stuff, it's more, the interaction, the ergonomics with our work environment. So things that we're working with, our workstation design and the type of work we're doing and the positioning of the work that we do. So lots of different things to consider there when we're trying to differentiate between, is this heart disease or is this a musculoskeletal disorder? So, kind of thinking about what we can do and when we start working on this, it's never too early to take action if we suspect an ergonomic injury. It's good to ask our workers about aches and pains and, do they experience more aches and pains when they do a certain task versus other things? Not kind of just brushing off or overlooking when a worker talks about aches and pains, because if we can prevent some of these injuries early on, that is going to probably reduce the amount of cost we spend on the injuries that occur and maybe keep the person at the work site a little bit longer and improve their productivity. So those risk factors, like I mentioned before, are any of those actions or conditions that contribute to worker discomfort. So discomfort is kind of the first sign of injury, or again, an acute injury that occurs due to those work conditions. So, just hitting on this because it's a really important part about safety management or managing yourself when you're on the work sites, that discomfort and injury. When we take a look at, how we investigate these a little bit, figure out who's doing the work. Is it a symptom when everybody does that task, or is it just a symptom when certain people do those tasks? Can you identify any of those risk factors, the weight, the body positioning, the environment that's around the person? the product that you're moving and how it may be packaged or how you're using it, the tools that you're using, the hand tools or other tools that you may be using, um, and how much of each of those risk factors are there. How's the work getting done? Does everybody do the task the same way? And then how often is the task done? A lot of times in agricultural settings, there's a protective factor because they're not doing the same task for many hours every day. They're just doing a little bit of this task, a little bit of that task. So that's kind of protective. Where maybe in a grain handling facility, the same person's doing the same task for a long period of time, or in industrial settings, then we sometimes see these musculoskeletal issues showing up more often. So again, major risk factors to look out for when we're trying to do the prevention is that forceful work. How much extra force do we have to do? Are we always exerting a large amount of force, or is it only occasionally? So how often does that happen? We talk about poor posture a lot, the lifting with the legs, the bending and twisting and turning, or if we're sitting in a chair, making sure our posture's good, that we take breaks and get up and move. I mentioned repetitive work already. Something we didn't mention too much already, but a huge factor in carpal tunnel and syndrome, which is one that affects the circulation to our hands, is vibration. We may have all ran a string trimmer or a lawn push mower for a while, or some other task where when we're done with it, our hands feel a little numb. So that vibration exposure is starting to impact our physical body. So recognizing those type of events and then using the right equipment maybe to minimize those vibrations, different tools, or there's some, special gloves or PPE we can wear to minimize those. When we talk about forceful work, that's that heavy lifting. Shoveling is one of those tasks. Brooming can even be one of those tasks, or cleaning up, carrying those heavy objects, or pushing and pulling. Anytime we have to forcefully grip on something, so shovels, brooms, that sort of thing, as we're gripping and using our arms, those can lead to some musculoskeletal disorders. And then if the materials we're working with are damp or heavy, we think about snow shoveling, maybe when it's light, fluffy snow versus the dense, wet snow, how that affects or has different effects on maybe even what tool we use. Maybe we want to shovel with a smaller head versus a larger shovel. Poor posture, a lot of things there. How we bend over, how we twist. It's always, if we're bringing our elbows above our shoulders, if we're extended to reach out to get to something, that wrist bending. They always talk about a neutral position is good. So if you bend your elbows at 90 degrees and put your thumbs straight up in the air, that's kind of your neutral position. Any, time we're getting out of that neutral position, it adds extra stress on our joints and muscles. Kneeling and squatting can put a lot of extra pressure on our knees and other parts of our body. And then standing just in a static position for too long. People sometimes tout the standing desks, but unless you're moving at your desk, just standing isn't much better than just sitting. So the standing desks, you'll see people moving around. I have a coworker, she does yoga, uh, moves her legs around while she's standing at the desk. So thinking about some of those posture changes we can do to improve that. Repetitive work, I mentioned hand and power tools already, but the vibration that comes from those, maybe the equipment controls and how we can change those. Tractor cabs are a great example of how those have changed over the years to be more ergonomic. A lot of the tractors now, we can do everything from the armrest. We don't need to move around too much or stretch and reach. Even computer keyboards and how we interact with those, or how often we interact with those. I'm amazed by a lot of my colleagues and friends that do voice to text instead of typing anymore. Some of that came from the medical field and they're transcribing stuff, but it helps for all of us. Trying to poke the little keys on your phone versus talking to it can help improve those ergonomics. And then we mentioned the vibration exposure. So lots of things to think about there. If we're sitting and standing, hand tools are a big one of those. But even sitting on a piece of machinery that vibrates, or standing next to a processing piece of machinery, whether that be elevators or other things that vibrate a lot, uh, can have some of those negative impacts on our circulation and can lead to some of those sprains and strains. Other risk factors that I mentioned early on, like those environmental factors, temperature, whether it's too hot, too cold, humidity, altitude, some of those play into things like our hydration levels. So if we're sweating a lot, making sure we stay hydrated. So that's an environmental factor we need to talk about. Coming into contact with sharp edges, even if they don't cut us, but if they bruise us, those can lead to things. Other pressure points when we're sitting or standing can lead to injuries. And then always that torque reaction, when things kick back at us or how much we're actually turning, thinking of all the levers in our body or with the tools that we're using, how we can use those to our advantage. And then these things kind of can compound with each other. So if we see these risk factors and we see a task that has a lot of these risk factors associated with it, so if it's that forceful work, poor posture, and repetitive work all stacked on top of each other, they're going to amplify those chances of having an injury. So reducing one is good. If we can reduce multiple ones of these risk factors is even better. If we can eliminate any of them, that's even the best. So another chat storm. So again, if you're multitasking, come back um, and answer this question in the chat, and we'll take a few seconds to take a look at that. So, what's a task you do that has an ergonomic risk factor, and what are those risk factors? So, thinking of a task you or some of your employees do, what would you say would be the name of the task, but then also what might some of those risk factors be? Typing is always a good one. Yes. If you do a lot of it, I try to avoid it, but any other ones, I assume cleaning dishes, working on ladders. Yeah, climbing up and down ladders, that's another one. After I'm done putting up Christmas lights, I feel like I've done a bunch of squats or stair climber or something. Sweeping, shoveling, ladders, yeah, all that stuff. Great ideas there. Shoveling and sweeping, if we could think of a better way to do that, right? Which maybe we're working on that. Some of us were at the grain weevil facility yesterday, and they have a attachment for their robot now that works in the grain that actually has one of those little brooms on the front of it, like they use for you can see on the end of string trimmers, the bristled brooms, mulch. So it seems like a lot of, there we go, sledgehammers and stuff like that. So it's still those manual hand tools that seem to get caught up on us than anything other than that. Yeah, office work. There's lots of things. Those boxes of paper and pieces of paper that we don't think about moving around. A lot of times when we work in our offices, we're not as mobile. So great answers. Thank you for that participation. So when we identify those risk factors, discomfort's kind of the first sign, or if we see injuries occurring, taking a look at what caused those. Um, we talked kind of the topics that we talked about and things we need to think about. Risk factors are a big part of it. Is an acute or or cumulative type injury, and what are those compounding risks that we think about? Major risk factors that we can take a look at right away, things like forceful work, bad postures, repetitive work, vibration exposures, and then those other ones we mentioned, the environment, contact, pressure points, and torque stuff. So some of the tools that we've talked about before, I always think this one's funny, and I mentioned stacking hay, so I won't spend too much time, but there are check sheets like this, and I'm happy to share those if people reach out to me. We can look at, I'm just going to run through this one quickly. What can we see as a potential risk factor when we're stacking hay or moving stuff? So then we can start looking at that root cause analysis, or what do we think is the problem based on those different things that we've talked about, the design of the task, the equipment, the how fast we have to work, what environment and the duration of the work. Lots of other things, and we'll share this slide set with you. I'm getting close to my time, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but thinking of the process we're using and down through this whole list. And then I mentioned PPE at the bottom of the list. We know that's kind of the last line of defense when we talk about protecting workers, but sometimes there's some PPE we can use to reduce some of these type of ergonomic injuries. So I'm going to slip through those questions in the interest of time, but just looking at, there's some examples of how we would identify a job like that. Machinery repair is another one. So this one's a little closer to working, whether it's mobile machinery or other types of machinery, lots of different uh, areas that we can take a look at there, from our postures to our pressure points to how much force we need to put on things to the vibrating tools that we're using. And then those environmental factors, like, are we laying on a cold floor? Are we standing in a cold room to do our repairs? In the case of feed mills, we know there's a lot of hot, steamy environments there in the heat and the noise and other things that can lead to those. And then machinery operations, similar things. I mentioned some of those hazards with the controls, the vibrations. A good way to minimize a lot of those exposures is to take breaks often. I had a first responder that was also a machinery operator that told me once that he gets out every once in a while and does a few squats to get the blood flowing in his legs. He said, I have to hide from my brothers so they don't see me doing this stuff. But I try to do that because I know the health implications of sitting in a vibrating machine too long. And then, like I mentioned, there's lots of things we can do. This is a sort of a minimized hierarchy of controls, but we know, engineering controls are the best. That's where we can change the actual device that we're working with or the engineering of it. Administrative controls is showing people how to do things differently or to take a look at it and try to suggest modifications to the work practice. And then PPE, like I mentioned, the anti-vibration gloves are a great example of that, or clothing that protects us from those sharp edges, protects our head with hard hats from bumping into things. So lots of things we could do there. Sometimes now we even have some exoskeletons that probably go across all these that help our body do certain tasks if we are bending over a lot or reaching over our head a lot. So those engineering controls, like I said, that would be looking at our tools and equipment. Um, Administrative controls would be how the work's organized and how we can change the tasks or rotate jobs that we do. Yeah, people get tired. And then PPE, like I said, anti-vibration gloves, knee pads, even shoe inserts help with our back. I know different shoes that I wear make an impact on the back I wear or my back and how it feels. In cold weather, having clothes that help keep us warm. In warm weather, help clothes that help us evaporative cool by sweating, and getting rid of things like that. And then finally, just because we do stuff the right way doesn't mean we can overdo it. So trying to lift a car, using your legs isn't going to be the best way to be doing that. And then, like I mentioned early on, some of those job improvement, can we do exercises and stretching and that sort of thing? I know it looks silly sometimes, but we can see some great benefits of doing those and having that. This would fall under most likely our administrative controls, right? It's not engineering, it's not personal protective equipment, but it's things we can do and tasks we can change to help us with that. So making sure we target those risk factors and be proactive, looking for those symptoms and hopefully not getting to the stages of signs and injuries when we do it proactively. So when we take care of our bodies, we can enjoy life a little bit more. So it really is about protecting you and your workers. And with that, I think I left a few minutes for Barb and her comments and some more questions. So reach out to me. My email's aaronyoder@unmc.edu, or reach out to anyone you know in the Grain Handling Safety Coalition or the Stand Up for Grain event. They can get a hold of me. So over to you, Barb.
All right, thank you. Excellent. Um, I am going to just reiterate, we had somebody ask about your body map.
Hmm.
And if you can get that sent to Catherine, we will make sure to get that posted under resources under this Wednesday session. So it'll be kind of more at the bottom of the page. We try to put resources that um, go with the session. So look for that here, I'll say in the next 24 hours or so. And also as an FYI, We do record these sessions. So probably in the next 24 to 48 hours, this will be posted on the Stand Up for Grain Safety website under the stand-up videos. So it's its own tab. We try to put everything that relates to this year's stand-up. So these will be out there. So in case you have teammates that weren't able to join us today, you can take a look at this at a later time. Use this as a resource for your teams. Maybe it's a little bit longer than a morning toolbox chat, but again, a great resource. Catherine is posting certificates. So you can download the certificate out of the chat, and that is specific to this session, or go to standupforgrainsafety.org, and that will recognize your participation in this entire week. And when you are checking out that certificate, it asks a few questions. Again, hey, what are some ideas, or what did your company do in recognition of this week? Did you have your own group meetings? So we'd really be interested in seeing that, seeing what everybody else did at their locations. Um, so again, there's a lot of things that are being posted in the chat. There's a link for a survey, a Zoom link. Go ahead and be sure to click on that. And while you guys are checking those things out, I'm going to hit a couple of questions here for Aaron. Let's see. Um, so what type of injuries, you hit on a little bit at the beginning, but what type of ergonomic injuries do you see reported the most, if those are things that you are tracking?
Yeah, and we know some of these, it's hard to find the reporting unless there's been like an injury claim or something along those ways. So, second, I'm going to encourage people to report injuries so that we know what we can do to help prevent them. But with that, there's sprains and strains. We see people seeking medical care and a cost incurred by companies and businesses when it comes to workers' compensation claims. And then one of our, especially in the outdoor work environments on our feed yards and other places, it's the slips, trips, and falls because we're always working in different weather conditions. And, the insurance provider actually told me that parking lots are the worst place for slips, trips, and falls. So being cautious when we get in and out of our vehicles and that sort of thing. So slips, trips, and falls, and then again, those sprains and strains.
I know this is a little something we were chatting yesterday as we
Hmm.
were at the grain weevil facility having a meeting, was that we do see a lot of these ergonomics, the cranking hoppers on trucks, or flipping lids on rail cars, or walking in bunkers, pulling tarps or things like that. We see a lot of back and shoulder strains. So again, just always interesting to watch as technology evolves, and what are those things that we can use instead of that person doing it. I know we joked this morning a little bit about, as we find technology, whether it's drones or robots to do things, are we going to be moving to a little bit of this as our strain? So again, jobs may change, but we always have to be conscious, as you've pointed out today, those targets, assessing that job, and what part of our body are we using repetitively. Um, you've been giving us tips throughout. So, what are a few of your, again, key takeaways for those ergonomic tips to prevent injuries? Just as kind of
Yeah.
a final here for us.
Yeah. I would say we talk a lot about safety culture. And I think a big
Mhm.
part of safety culture is good communication. So we're communicating with our workers. And part of that communication is asking them about injuries, asking about strains, asking them about pains they may have. A lot of times it takes that, you need to build up that communication, build up that culture before people are willing to share that stuff. We found that in some of our projects where if you survey people, send them a paper form, they say, I've never had any injuries. Then you start talking to them and they start showing you scars or talking about their back pain and things like that. So I think an important part of the ergonomic stuff is that safety culture and making sure you're communicating with your workers, or if you're a worker yourself, communicating with your management. to say, hey, this job is painful for me, or don't be afraid of them saying, well, just toughen up. We joked about that early on, suck
Yeah.
it up, rub some dirt on it, whatever it is. But good communication is really going to help when it comes to all aspects of safety and health. But I think it's critically important for ergonomics that we're communicating with our workers, or as we are workers, communicating with our management about safety hazards or some of these risk factors that we may see out there on the workplace.
Yeah, yeah, so much agree. Again, as we talked about ergonomics and working sitting, using our keyboards properly in the office has been around for, 20, 30 years. Again, in the grain industry or agriculture in general or industry, it is again, we're tough, walk it off, suck it up. So we're past that in our life. And if you're a manager, it's going back to that cost slide that Aaron showed us.
Hmm.
Um, it's important to keep our workers safe, but if the thing that motivates you is, man, an injured worker is not a productive worker, an injured worker costs a lot. I mean, think about that piece of it. Um, so, um, Aaron, if you haven't seen in the chat, Catherine did post a PDF of
Hmm.
this, so anybody go ahead and download it. But again, we will take out those key posters that you should be able to print and reuse and post them on the website. Again, a lot of great resources. And as a reminder to everybody, if you have Spanish as a first language employees that would better serve to learn or to get this information that Aaron presented today, we have this as a Spanish language session this afternoon at 2 o'clock Central Time. So make sure to get your employees on there. And again, that also will be recorded if you need to use that at a later date. All videos will be posted on the Stand Up for Grain Safety website. And that will be done again, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. We do a little, front and back end editing on those just to make them more usable for you. Um, Thank you again, Aaron, for this great session today. And thank you again for what you do for our industry. Again, your continued research on PPE to help keep people safe. You talked about your tractor safety that you go out and do. Yeah, my teenage son 8 years ago, that was one of the first things that he lived on a farm, but he went to work for a farmer. And the guy said, hey, before you work for me, you're going through tractor safety. So there's
Hmm.
a lot of resources. You saw again a lot of our sponsors. And again, thank you for them. A lot of universities out there that are willing to share their knowledge and information with us. So thank you, Erin. Love working with you. And hey, everybody, have a wonderful Wednesday and continue working safe. Thank you very much. And that concludes our session for today.
Thanks, everyone. Reach out at any time.
Thank you, Aaron.